All right, because now it's time for our first keynote speech. Amit Kapoor is honorary chairman of the Institute for Competitiveness, and now I leave the floor to him.
Good evening. I hope I'm audible. I just wanted to make sure that I'm audible right now.
Yes, you're on the air. Everything's working.
Awesome. Good evening. It's absolutely a pleasure to be sharing my views. In fact, I was listening to the previous sessions, and I felt that there were some very exciting things that were being talked about. But I would like to reiterate a few points as to what's really happening and how the world has come to be as to where we are right now. If you really look at it, the first question that begs to be answered right now, and when we are really talking about resilient value chains or future proofing value chains, or if you really talk about people and policy as enablers, the fundamental question is that are we really looking at a tirade against globalization? What is the cause for this narrative that is actually happening? Because if we really get that understanding right, then we get our answers right, and then we are able to strategically define as to what we need to do. The first thing, if you really look at it, like there have been fundamental gaps within what you would call as the capitalistic system that has existed, and they have got exposed because of the pandemic and the happenings of the last few decades. In fact, what we have seen with the pandemic is that we have seen a clear demarcation. We have seen a swift movement towards the disenchantment that was actually existing. And what was the reason for the disenchantment? The reason for that disenchantment were actually two things, and that is actually something that we have to look at as corporate enterprises, whether you're talking about manufacturing or you talk about services. The first thing was disparity that actually exists within the world. And the disparity that we are really talking about, it is about the wealth accumulation that happens at the top and the kind of disparity that happens at the bottom. There have been huge debates that actually happen about corporate CEOs' pay versus what people are actually getting or the workers on the factory floor. The second thing, and there have been huge political debates that have actually happened. And there is a huge issue of a nationalistic agenda, as I see. And the challenge here today is that a lot of thinking that is actually happening within the political system and within the corporate enterprise, it is being driven by what you would call as the whole nationalistic agenda. And the politics of disparity. There are three things that I actually see, and it has happened across the world. It is not that it is just happening in one part of the world. Brexit is a very interesting reflection of an anti-globalization idea. So that is about making countries great again, or something like immigration or tirade against immigration. And the second thing is like about making our borders much stronger, stealthier, and so on and so forth. So are countries and politicians getting it wrong? And we have to ask that question, because if we have to make the right policy choices, we have to make sure that we answer these questions right. So the question that actually further gets accentuated or needs to be asked is, what are the real reasons for creating resilience within the value chain? So is it the disruptions like pandemic, the climate change? Without a doubt. Because this tells us that there are challenges, there are vulnerabilities that actually exist, and we need to focus on them. So clearly, but one thing has to be clearly seen, that these are the strategies that we have to look at. But when you talk about globalization per se, why did globalization happen, or what were the main thing that was happening through globalization? That was about monitoring, controlling, or directing activities for creating value. That was a clear-cut thing that was happening. But now the question is that when we talk about competitiveness, what is it that we are really looking at? And the fundamental issue is, if we want to have resilient value chains, it has to answer two things. And one of them is going to be that how do we really talk about productivity improvement? And that is what all the enterprises are always going to be talking about. But the second thing, and one of the most important things, is that how do I actually improve the quality of life of the citizens? Because if we don't get it right, we will always get into very wrong political set of debates. We have to fundamentally understand that it is about economic progress plus social progress. It's about quality of life of people. We have to enhance the per capita incomes of people. It does not mean that we have to accumulate wealth at the top. So what I'm really saying here or suggesting here is that we have to fundamentally alter the way enterprises function. We have to really reimagine the capitalistic system per se. If you're just talking about value chains, no, it is much beyond that. It is about reimagining the capitalistic system that we are really talking about. But when we talk about competitiveness, and I think it's an age-old tirade, and a lot of you have really talked about it. And there are four things, and that is land, labor, capital, and data. And of course, there was a beautiful statement made in one of the previous sessions that was data is the new oil. So, of course, these are the important aspects, but there are two fundamental questions that have to be really clearly understood. And that is about land and labor. When I say land, it is about resources and how those resources are available and how this affects various sets of locations. In fact, when you talk about locations and the effect on locations, it's about countries or states or provinces that you're really talking about, or districts that you're, or counties that you're really looking at, even the cities for that matter. So when you really talk about the supply chain issues, the pandemic exposed something very interesting, that the failure of delivery of product at the city level was one of the bigger challenges. We have talked about the Suez Canal. We have talked about issues of semiconductors. We have talked about issues of automobile sector or the white goods sector actually having an impact. But the question was that how do we deliver products within the cities as well? We have not really looked at that. The resilience will have to get developed from ground up. It is not going to be something which has to, we are talking about the larger lay of the land, but the question is that how do we take it to the cities? In fact, if you really talk about two countries, like you are doing this session in Italy and India, these were the two countries which suffered the most because of the pandemic. And the failure of the healthcare system in these two countries was a very interesting reflection of the failure of the supply chains. We did not even understand what resilience is all about. If you were really talking about oxygen supplies, or you were talking about medicines, you were talking about doctors. So there were massive issues that were actually existing within the system that really got exposed. Well, of course, you would actually take steps later in terms of saying that we will create the PPEs and we will create some very powerful manufacturing systems. You really run it across. But the larger question was that how do we really understand what the world requires? How do we really project what needs to be really set? And we have never had that very understanding of how the world needs to really look at it. In the future, if you really look at it, uh, the fundamental thing I feel is that humanity is in crisis. And when I say humanity is in crisis, it is in crisis for one big thing, and that is climate change. And that climate change is going to affect everything that we do under the sun. We will have to see that when you talk about resilience, when we talk about value chains, we will have to fundamentally alter the way we think. And we will have to really say how climate change can actually affect certain sets of locations that we are really talking about. But then the question here is that can I actually make that change very quickly? Or the world order that we are really talking about, the global value chains that we were really thinking of, were they actually, and the existing system, that did it happen in a day? No, it did not happen in a day. It took years for this to happen. In fact, it took decades. The system that we are seeing right now is something which was really starting in the 1930s and the 1940s, and we are seeing that reflection. But then the larger thing is that we have failed as a system to really deliver products to people. And enterprises have actually been one of the big reasons for that. And how does corporate purpose get defined here? What are the corporations really going to be doing about this? And the next thing is that if you want to reconfigure your value chains, it looks very exciting that a country would say that I'm going to create a fab unit or a fabrication unit or a semiconductor unit. We are actually going to make our own things. But the dependence that you actually have on various sets of things and resources is huge. In fact, it becomes a very interesting political statement. Oh, we should actually not do any kind of trade with China. But China controls 60% of the world trade in many, many interesting sets of things. If you really talk about pharmaceutical products and manufacturing of pharmaceutical products, India could be the biggest generic producer in the world, but APIs are actually coming from China. So, how do we dismantle that? Can it happen in a day? No, it is actually going to be a marathon that we have to really talk about. So we have to have vision for the future. We are talking about good 20 years or 30 years. Technologies will be there, data will be there, artificial intelligence will be there. But the question is going to be that how do I really look at the future and how do I define the future for ourselves? The next thing that is, and of course, when you talk about manufacturing, manufacturing is exciting in terms of like the opportunities that it creates, the job opportunities and the possibilities that exist. But there is a clear-cut case that there is going to be a servicization of manufacturing. And you have talked about, like you were talking about ecosystems that are actually going to get created. But the bigger thing is about servicization. And how do I actually learn from various other sets of industries? One of the industries from where we can clearly understand and look at is education. It's a service industry, but how education and especially higher education really resolved itself to really giving the education to people in terms of really going online and doing things is very, very important. So there was a huge disruption that actually happened. In fact, in India, what I would like to share is that how technology was actually used to really pushing forward the whole idea of education to the masses. Otherwise, if you really talk about the educational losses that would have occurred because of 2 years of no schooling, would have actually will take about decade, 8 years to 10 years to cover the knowledge gaps. But when you really talk about this, the question here is really look at that serviceization. How do I really look at delivery at the end? And then this also has had a huge issue on the whole idea of what you would call as the industry structures. And fundamental alteration of industry structures has happened. And we are really going to see a very clear demise of many, many industry structures that we have seen. And that is where we will have to see as to what industry we are really talking about. Automotive today is going to be hugely different from what we are actually anticipating in the next decade or so. In fact, we are already seeing the change, how climate is affecting it, and or how the policies for green vehicles is affecting it. But what we are seeing is your fundamental alteration of industry models and industry structures is going to happen. But the next thing, and of course, this is the whole issue of how the movement of goods is going to happen. But do we really even talk about the most important aspect, and that is about labor? We do talk about skilling. That is a very important aspect. We do talk about like how do we really improve the quality of our labor and give them the best of knowledge. But the question here is there is a larger political debate, and that is where corporations will have to fundamentally come in and really start fighting that out. Today, what I see is that corporations are actually not taking their role as set of people who can bring change. They're more as silent observers. Wherein, if you really talk about that change, it is a question of immigration should be stopped. And there has been that tirade across the board. And somebody said in one of the talks that immigration is exceedingly important. Yes, because this leads us to an important thing that it is about that creative economy. It has three things which drive the world. And that is how, in fact, I did that work with Richard Florida when we really looked at the creative economy of countries and creative economy of Indian states. It was three things which fundamentally matter: technology, tolerance, and talent. And when you talk about tolerance to ideas becomes the most important thing that is really going to happen. That is going to drive that. If we are not tolerant, we might actually look at wrong things and wrong aspects and bring that change. And we will actually go on a wrong trajectory in the world if we really get that. The next thing is, and will work change? And when you talk about fundamentally all this and how work will change and how will it affect manufacturing, there is this whole huge debate that is happening right now. And that debate is all about what you would call as the great resignation. And if that thing is true, the great resignation, people are leaving, 50% of the staff is going to leave, that means we will have to really understand the models of work that are actually going to come up. And manufacturing setups will have to get ready for those set of things. That's going to be one of the things that is going to be there. People are really going to look at work very differently now than what they were actually looking at in the past. In the past, it was for a lot of countries. I know it's not true for Europe, but for a lot of countries, especially the developing world, work is worship. Work is something that was just you live for work. You don't live to actually enjoy the opportunity that you have been actually given to be on this planet and look at the things. But then, if you really look at it, what corporations should really look at doing is that they have to be the force for good, solving the problems of the world. Of course, create that resilience, but that resilience will have to be created over a long period of time. You will have to react to how these pandemics are going to happen. This pandemic is not the last one. I see or I foresee that there are more pandemics that are just around the corner. With the climate change that is happening, the pandemics are going to be far frequent. The gap between the last two pandemics was 100 years. I really anticipate that it is going to be far lesser as we actually look at. But one more important thing, which we should not forget, and that is that it's the globalized order that actually gave the opportunity for us to really resolve this crisis at such a pace. The pharmaceutical industry is a great reflection of how people were able to come together and create a vaccine for this crisis. This vaccine was created in good 6 to 8 months' time, and this has really helped us really resolve the situation. In fact, today, if you're able to sit in person in Italy at a venue, that is a reflection of a globalized world order. So the question is, we should not get into that political tirade. We need to actually say, resilience is important, but that resilience will have to be built on ideas of equitable growth, inclusive growth, which improves the quality of life of people and things. And then it is also going to be about creating that robust and secure supply chains, but that really focuses on demands and cost efficiency. So these are a few words that I thought I should share, some of my ideas, and I know my time's up. But thanks a lot for the opportunity, and I hope I made some sense.
Well, thank you so much. And this is the applause from here, Villarban Cernobbio, for your really outstanding keynote speech.